Thank you so much, Brother Jackson. It's good to be with you all again today, and I'm glad Ginger could come and be with us too. And it's always a blessing to be with this good congregation. We look forward to it, and heard about the good news that the preacher and his wife have, and that's just wonderful. Absolutely. You know, this Tennessee Valley is a wonderful place to live. One of the few drawbacks associated with it is that ever since I moved here, I haven't been able to breathe. I mean, other than that, it's been just wonderful. But we do have, of course, the allergy season upon us, and that seems to be my difficulty. I was talking to Bobby about his situation, and he said he went to the doctor. See, that's a mistake I don't make. Don't go to the doctor. But you know I'm kidding, right? Because if you go, they're going to tell you something's wrong with you. I mean, that's their job, so I don't go. I already know something's wrong with me, probably on a lot of different levels. Anyway, it's good to see you this morning. We're continuing our study in this class on the period between Malachi and Matthew, otherwise known as the intertestamental period. And we're ready to look at the period of Roman domination of the Bible lands. Now, I have a handout here and that you can pick up after class, and we'll put them back there in the back. There's also a handout for the class the next time I'm able to come, and it concerns religion in the time of when first century Christianity was developing. That's what that handout is about. This one's about the period of Roman domination in the Bible lands. And I noticed as I was reviewing the material, after I had asked your very capable and wonderful secretary to print these up for me, that I had made a mistake and left a fragment of a sentence where it didn't need to be. And so it's in that first paragraph, and you'll find it when you see it there. It says, while this took place Antipater and Idumean, that just needs to be marked out. And next time we bring some, we'll have that corrected. But let's think about this period of Roman domination. Now, last time I was here, we talked about the period that we referred to historically as the Maccabean or Hasmonean period. That's that brief period of independence when the Maccabean revolt took place. You remember we talked about how that began and so forth. And as that period drew to a close, the people who were there in Jerusalem were involved in a lot of political wrangling. Now, we have a lot of political wrangling in our world today. And this was at least as bad as that, or even worse. And it involved people such as Salome Alexandra, as a woman, a wife of Aristobulus the first, another fellow named Alexander Janus, and Hyrcanus the second, Aristobulus the second. These are all people that were struggling to be in charge of Palestine during this period of relative independence. The last supposed high priest before the beginning of what we're calling the Roman period was this Aristobulus II. Well, all this fighting and fussing and carrying on that was taking place in Jerusalem drew the attention of the Roman Republic, soon to become the Roman Empire. Their main thing that they required of the people out from Rome was that they be quiet, that they behave themselves, they pay their taxes, they do what the emperor tells them to, or at this time the Senate tells them to. And people in Jerusalem weren't doing that. While this activity was taking place, there was a fellow named Antipater. Now, Antipater was an Idumean. Idumea is just east of Palestine. It's east of Jerusalem. And he'd been active behind the scenes during this period of independence we're calling the Hasmonean period. And during that time, this Antipater, he managed to worm his way into having really good graces with Rome. And so he is made the civil ruler of Judah and Jerusalem by Pompey. Now, Pompey, that's Pompey, it's the name of the volcano and so forth. It was very famous in history. But General Pompey was one of the consuls that served the Roman Senate. Now, the Roman Senate actually was the ruling entity of Rome during this period of the Republic. But like our system, of course, our system goes back to that and beyond. Like our system, they had a legislative branch, which is the Senate, and they also had an executive branch, the people to get the things done, you see. Now, the Senate sort of had the judicial aspect to it too, but we won't get into all that. Pompey was one of the consuls, consul. He was one of the consuls, and he got to be a consul because a very effective general. He conquered Syria and at that time annexed Palestine. This is how the Romans come to be in charge of the area. Now, this Roman period is very important in the context of the beginning of the church and the development of the New Testament, because Rome, beginning in 63 BC, the conquest of Syria by Pompey and then the annexation of Palestine, Rome is in charge in terms of civil government in the area of Jerusalem. Now, Rome, the way Rome operated was they would allow you, if you were a conquered area, a certain amount of independence if you behaved yourself and kept yourself subservient to Rome. Now, the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem took advantage of this policy, and they kind of they tried to play it in a balanced way. Rome also knew that they're going to have a real hard time getting Jews to be subservient to the Roman policy of emperor worship. Now, I'm talking about, let me just put this in context. Rome is a republic, famous for being a republic, sort of after the pattern of the Greeks, until it becomes an empire. Now, throughout this period of time, religious freedom, if you want to call it that, if you want to call what they had religion, and we'll talk about that later, was allowed. The period of empire, they continued to allow certain levels of religious freedom if you stayed subservient to Rome. They knew that the Jews would not buy that totally. So they gave the Jewish people a dispensation from emperor worship when the empire began to take over, and that comes a little bit later. However, no matter what Rome did for and with the Jewish population, they continued to desire to have an independent nation like they they thought they had anyway, back during this Maccabean and Hasmonean period, which is totally between the two testaments, you see. But it was like there's always been, during that period of time, there was always this barely concealed hostility, just right under the level, people full of hatred and so forth. It ended up producing, eventually, 3 Jewish wars. The war under Nero, which started in 67 A.D., which is, 37 years after Jesus, about, and then Trajan and the Bar Kokhba revolt during the reign of Hadrian. So you have wars between the Romans and the Jews, rebellions on the part of the Jews, that took place all the way up through the 2nd century. Now, when Rome realized what they were dealing with, and particularly when you get into the period of empire, after the period of the Republic, Rome essentially has control over Jerusalem beginning in 63 BC, so 63 years before Christ, Rome's in control of the area. How did they control it? Well, Rome had 2 kinds of provinces. They had proconsular provinces. Now, those were the provinces that were happy to be in the Roman sphere of influence. And they would be ruled over directly by the Roman Senate. If you had a province that was unruly, they called that a procutorial province. And they put a heavier-handed individual over provinces like that, called a procurator. Of course, we all know from reading our Bibles, particularly back when we get toward the crucifixion of our Lord, that Jerusalem was ruled over, Palestine was ruled over by Pontius Pilate, who was a procurator. So that tells us that, Jerusalem was always, Judah was always in trouble with its overseers, the Romans. Now, the period and place of our interest had a number of these procurators, and we'll talk about some of them. And in the handout, we try to put some of them there, but there are passages that are associated with the activities of these men, and we'll center in when we get over to Pilate. Now, I mentioned this fellow Antipater. And Antipater would be considered, as all Idumeans would be considered, by the what we'd call the strong Jewish element. He would be considered a half-breed individual because he wasn't fully Jewish because of, where, you go back to John 4 and you see situations with Samaria. This would be something like that. And so Antipater, though, because he's worked his way into the good graces with the Romans, he has been in control of the area for Rome under the aegis of the Syrian proconsul. So he appoints this Antipater. That's why we're paying attention to him. He appoints a man named Herod as the governor of Galilee. Now, Galilee, of course, is north of Jerusalem, but he's in that area. This man becomes known as Herod the Great. Now, there's not much that we would consider great about him, but he does rule this area from 37 BC up to 4 BC. He was a builder. He was an individual he thought that he could get in, since he was half Jewish, or the Jews considered him only half Jewish, he thought, I'll be able to get into the good graces of these people if I build a lot of things for them and make their country more beautiful and so forth. So one of the things that he undertook to do, and we see Jesus out walking by the temple, and he said, you tear this thing down. He wasn't talking about the actual temple. He's talking about the temple of his body. Now, rebuild it in 3 days. Remember that. Well, the building that they were walking by was one of the wonders of the world at that time, because Herod the Great had spent a lot of money and a lot of time beautifying the temple. And we know we had Solomon's temple, and it was destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar. You have Zerubbabel's temple, which was built by the Jews as they came back from Babylonian captivity. And this temple, this basic structure that we find in our New Testaments, was Zerubbabel's temple. But Herod basically just redid it. He remodeled it. And, really built it up again. And they say that, it's on a hill. If you ever go over there, you can, you see the remnants thereof today. You can see that it's up on Mount Zion. If you go over to the Garden of Gethsemane and you look back, you can see it there. And can you imagine if it was in blue-white polished marble, what a wonderful shining thing it would be. Well, he did all of that. He had a lot of other big projects that he did, hoping to ingratiate himself with the Jewish people. He built something called Herod's tomb. He wasn't buried there, but he built Herod's tomb. He built the fortress at Masada. And historians tell us that he never got to Masada. He never saw that, but we read about that. That was the last place that the Roman army was able to subdue in the war that started in 67 and was concluded in AD 70 or 71. But his plan didn't work. And you look at Matthew chapter 2, and you certainly understand why the Jews wouldn't go for this kind of fella. Because when he heard about, when he started hearing about these prophecies associated with the birth of Jesus, the way he decided to handle the situation was to kill all the babies. And this is the man that did that, Matthew 2, this Herod the Great. Now, he's not called the Great because he is great. He is called the Great because he is the first in the line that flowed out of him, because there are a lot of Herods that come after this first Herod. He murdered those babies, and then he also murdered his own wife, a lady named Mariamne. But he ingratiated himself with Rome. And see, first he gets to be the governor of Galilee, which is north of Rome. But then he pays so much attention to politics in Rome that he ends up being named the King of the Jews by Rome. And how did he deal with the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees and so forth? Well, the last one was a fellow named Antigonus, and he had him crucified. And not only crucifying him, but he beheaded him. So he wanted to make sure this fellow was dead. I remember a number of years ago that I had an opportunity to go to Ghana in West Africa. And over there, I was there I've been there twice, but the first time I was there, Brother Royce Reynolds was still working there, and his wife Cindy. Presently now, his daughter and her husband are working in that area. And when somebody from out of town, and we were from way out of town, goes to a village in Ghana, and we went to Yendi, which is a big village. Really, it's a city. You go in and pay your respects to the local regent, local king, the man in charge. And so we went in and we saw him, and went and gave him some gifts and told him what we were doing there. We were going to behave ourselves and all that sort of thing. And he was very nice, very nice. And then we left, and when we got home, a few months later, we found out that somebody else in his family decided that they wanted to be the local big guy. And they thought they were cheated out of the job previously. So they got him, and they shot him, and they stabbed him a bunch of times. And then they chopped him up and burned him up, and then took the parts to different places. They also wanted to be sure that that Yana didn't come back, because over there a lot of folks believe that they'll come back, you see. Well, that's nothing new, because here Herod, who's not a nice man, has Antigonus, the last of the Hasmoneans, has him crucified and beheaded. Now, Herod's sons ruled the area after his death. One son named Archelaus ruled Judea from 4 B.C. to 86. That's 4 years before Christ, 6 years during Christ. A.D., you remember, it's easy to get confused about this, and this is one of the most important things that we want to mention. And that is that this B.C., before Christ, and A.D., which stands for the year of the Lord, Anno Domini, that system was in place a long time before historians figured out, using the Bible, by the way, figured out actually the year that Jesus was born. Because we always want to think that, of course, he was born in 1 A.D., 1, the year of the Lord. And it wasn't so, because he was actually born between 6 and 4 B.C. And the reason we know that is that there is a record in history of these babies being killed by Herod, and he dies himself in 4 B.C. So we have kept the same dating system, because to change everything would create even more confusion than we have now. But basically, that's why on some of our church buildings, we'll have AD 33. And you know what we mean by that? That this is the Lord's church, that it was established on the day of Pentecost, AD 33. When it actually could have been, in terms of the number we associate with the date, it could have been 30, could have been 29. The point is, none of that makes any difference. Everything happened exactly when the Bible says that it happened. But when you start reading some other material, you may say, well, now these dates seem funny. There's a reason for that. It's because that things changed over the years in terms of the level of our knowledge. Well, Archelaus is the one after Herod the Great. The Romans sent him away because he was foolish. And they put in place other rulers associated with the Herod family. A man named Herod Antipas ruled from 4 B.C., when Herod the Great died, up to AD 39. He's the man that we read about in Matthew chapter 11, who killed John the Baptist, also in Luke 13. He is the one, this Herod Antipas, is the one that Jesus called that fox. Remember that? He is the man of Luke 9:7 and 13:31, and he is man, this Herod Antipas, was a man whom, before Jesus was tried, in Luke 23, 8 through 11. And it's a fascinating thing to look at this material in understanding the context of who these people are. And one of the reasons that I like to study this material and have spent time studying this material is that the more we look into secular history that's written by people who are not inspired, who are not apostles, or people upon whom the apostles laid their hands, we find that the Bible is verified over and over. Not that the Bible requires verification. I always want to point this out. What does God say about his word? All inspired, all scriptures given by inspiration of God, profitable for doctrine and so forth. So the Bible doesn't require verification, but when it's laid out before us, it really is helpful to see that every time somebody truly examines the historical record, they find that the Bible record is correct, and it's right, and it's true. The example of this that is often cited is the scholar William Ramsey. William Ramsey did not believe that the Bible would be the Word of God. And although we mention this all the time, it's very important. His book about the travels of the Apostle Paul, he starts out saying, I don't believe this can be right. And then he goes and traces everything that Paul says and is said in Luke. He talks about Paul, but he's really examining Luke's record in the book of Acts. And what he finds is that it's historically accurate. And everybody who has investigated the Bible on that basis. Now, I'm not talking about folks who look at the Bible trying to prove it's wrong, because they'll do all sorts of tricks and mean things to attempt to do that. But when we look at the Bible from an objective point of view, we find that the record is verified every time. Now, with regard to Herod Antipas, look at Luke chapter 23 for just a moment. Luke chapter 23. This is the kind of thing, when we study like this, we're studying basically history that goes with the Bible. It's helpful to go back to the Bible and see what it says about the material that we're already looking at from another perspective. So the text, here we are at the time that Jesus is moving toward the cross. And the text says that a whole multitude of people in Luke 23 arose and led him, Jesus, to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, did Jesus ever do that? He never did that. Did he ever say, don't pay your taxes? Actually, what did he say? Pay your taxes. Render unto Caesar that which he looked at the coin and said, that's not mine. That's Caesar's. So these people, these are the Jewish people that want to get rid of Jesus. They're jealous of him. They're afraid of him. So what they do is they make up this false charge. Now remember, when we started our class today, we were still talking about the period of Senate rule or the period of republic. But the period of republic ceased when Augustus Caesar became Caesar. Augustus became Caesar. And then the period of the empire began. Caesar Augustus, that's empire. And then you have, and we'll get into the others as they come up in the text. So these guys think that the way that we can really get Jesus in trouble is to get him in trouble by accusing him of being in a state of rebellion against the Romans. Now, what's ironic about that? Who was actually always almost in a state of rebellion against the Romans? The Jewish establishment that is now accusing Jesus of being in a state of rebellion against the Romans. It's fascinating to me. So and Pilate asked him, this is verse 3 of Luke 23, art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, thou sayest it. And Jesus knows who he's dealing with. And you say, why didn't he just give him a long, straight answer? Because he knew it wouldn't do him any good. Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew every detail of what would unfold before him. He had been preparing his men for that. We'll talk about that later in our lessons today. But he knew what was coming. And so he just looks at old Pilate and says, you said it. Somebody said, you go up to Pulaski once a month? You said it. I do. That's the kind of language we have here. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and the people, I find no fault in the man. And that's because Pilate knew the law, the Roman law, and he knew Jesus hadn't done anything. And The Bible says in verse 5 of Luke 23, and they were the more fierce, just made them mad. You know, somebody gets so mad they're just hot. He stirreth up all the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. And so, old Pilate, now who's Pilate? Remember? You had proconsular provinces, you had procuratorial provinces. Pilate is a procurator. He has to deal with unruly people. And what do politicians like to do if they can? They like to avoid conflict, and if there is conflict, they like to blame somebody else or get somebody else to deal with the problem. Now, I'm not talking about all politicians, but I'm talking about all of them like Pilate. All right? So when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, Herod, remember we talked about the Herods started out over Galilee. He sent him to Herod, who himself was at Jerusalem at that time, Herod Antipas. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous. It's not Herod the Great, it's Herod Antipas. He was desirous to see him of a long season. He'd been wanting to meet Jesus for a long time because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. So Herod, he's not interested in becoming faithful, is he? He's not interested in becoming a Christian. He wants to see a miracle. He wants to see the show. And he questioned him with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. Jesus didn't talk to him. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And when Herod with his men of war set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, they sent him again to Pilate. So they sent him back to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for they were of enmity between themselves. So they had been cross purposes. This event put them together, this Herod and Pilate. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, he said to them, you brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof you accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent him to you, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. Because remember they had this custom, they're going to release one at this time, Passover time. And when they said that, the Jews cried out all at once, saying, away with him, and release unto us Barabbas, who for a certain sedition made in the city and murder was cast into prison. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them. But they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Now, we talk about Pilate involved with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and we know he was. However, based on Luke's account, who really did that? It was this cadre, listen to my words, not all the Jews, but this cadre of corrupt leadership among the Jewish people in Jerusalem. Wasn't people like Simeon and Anna, faithful servants in the temple. Wasn't people like Joseph and Mary, who moved heaven and earth to go and register for the census and pay their taxes. Wasn't the people from the families that resulted in giving us the apostles of Jesus Christ. And I like to remind people that most Jewish people in first century Palestine not only would result ultimately being appalled at what happened to Jesus, they were looking for somebody to be Jesus, to be the Savior. But it's like every other group of people on the earth, who we end up in positions of leadership among us, can take us places that we don't want to go. It's happened with people throughout history. Ultimately, of course, just go back to World War II. How many Germans, had they known what Hitler was up to, would have been for that? Not many. And so forth and so on. So, this man, Herod Antipas, he is the one before whom Jesus was tried in Luke 23. Now, a few years after this event, he was sent to Gaul, which is France, by the Emperor Caligula in AD 39. And then we have Herod Philip the Tetrarch. Now, tetrarch just simply means a ruler over 1/4 of the whole place. Tetra, 4, the ruler over the 1/4 of the area. And he's mentioned in Luke 3:1. Aristobulus is of interest because of his children. This Aristobulus that we mentioned earlier. And I know that's why, I have the little printout. You can kind of go back and get your Bible dictionary down and look up these names. And I'll fill in the blanks for you. If you've got the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia or any good Bible dictionary, you can fill all this in. Now, Aristobulus' children, for instance, Herod Agrippa I, who ruled from 37 to 44 AD, he's the one who killed James, the Apostle James. And he's also the one who died very dramatically. The record of it is by Luke in Acts chapter 12. He was up giving a speech, and it was a hot day, and he was already sick with evidently a bad case of worms, people tell us. And aren't you glad we don't live in the time when we get worms? Or if we do, we can handle them. Anyway, he died rather nastily, one might say. And then Caligula, who was very much like Herod Agrippa I, named him King Agrippa. Now, he was in Rome when Caligula was assassinated, and eventually was involved in the Emperor Claudius becoming emperor, and that put him in good graces with Claudius. And so by AD 41, Agrippa had been given control over more territory than even Herod the Great had had. And as noted, he died there in 44 in Caesarea by the sea. Now, it's important to us to kind of trace this out. Herod Agrippa I had 2 infamous daughters. They say we don't have women on the pages of history. We do. Every page. Bernice, or Bernice, she was really a winner. She was in an incestuous relationship with her brother, Herod Agrippa II. That's not good, right? But on top of that, she had an affair with the Roman general Titus. Busy girl. His other daughter was Drusilla. Where do we remember her? She was the wife of the procurator Felix. And this brother, Herod Agrippa II, ruled the area from 53 to 75. He's the man of Acts 25. And you think about, we've always thought when he said, almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian. We've always wondered now, is it possible that this was sincere on the part of Herod Agrippa II? And I just think about the kind of folks he came from. And what you'd have to conclude is not much chance in him making a sincere response to the preaching of the Apostle Paul. Well, that provides for us sort of a general historical rundown of the people who were running the show from a secular point of view, from a civic point of view, during the time of the establishment of the church. there's just a couple of other things that I'd like to cover before we kind of bring this study to the close. And most of it I want to cover the next time I'm here. And that will deal with the religion, the other religions and ideas that were in the air at the time of the establishment of the church. But just as we finish up this morning, keep in mind that the world that the church was established in was in many ways a very sophisticated world. And it was very fundamental in a lot of ways. But in terms of language, you had Latin, which was used by the Romans, and in the emperor's court, if you went to the emperor's court, either you or your spokesperson was going to speak Latin. And then Koine Greek, which was the language of the Mediterranean world, the common language, the language in which the New Testament is written. Aramaic, very common in Palestine. It was a Semitic language of ancient Syria. We find it in Mark in chapter 5, 7, and 15. And then Hebrew, the traditional language of the Jews and, of course, of the Old Testament. In the time of Jesus, Hebrew was used primarily by the priests and the scribes and the Pharisees. And you notice how surprised everybody was in the book of Acts when Paul moved his hand and began speaking Hebrew, because that indicated to the crowd, this fellow knows what he's talking about. This fellow's a well-trained individual. Well, it's about time for our class to conclude. So remember to make that little correction right here in that first paragraph. I missed that when I reprinted this. And where it says, while this took place Antipater and Idumean, just mark that out. And I'll try to make corrections in it later. Thank you for your kind attention this morning.